I think that people really get upset with the way you frame it, and so that they get mad. Oh, Myron's taking the side of the white man, and Myron's saying, "Well, Muslims can't be here, and Muslims don't have a place here." And I think a lot of that is lost in translation, and maybe that can be particularly because of how bombastic you are in your delivery or how you let people know things straight without softening the blow. But it is true, and there's something to be said about these types of actions being done in Times Square. First of all, I'm not knocking the intentions of any of the brothers who are praying there, and I'm not saying that that prayer was not accepted or invalid or anything like that. But I think there's something a little bit more important to realize here in the grand scheme of things. And that's precisely this. When you are praying as a Muslim, the best place to pray is a masjid. I don't think that any Muslim would ever disagree with that. And the only times where it's viable to, let's say, pray outside of a mosque, in the street, or in some public walkway, would be in the instance where you don't have access to a masjid or there's a necessity at hand, like the masjid is too packed or anything like that. And if you guys had watched my last stream, I had specifically said and laid out conditions and exceptions for a situation where the masjid is too packed on Jummah, which is Friday prayer, or Eid prayer, which is two times a year. And so maybe sometimes worshipers will leak onto the street, or worshipers will leak onto the parking lot. And in those instances, I don't find that to be a problem individually, at least myself. And I know some people may disagree, but that's my opinion, because those are one-offs. And obviously, these houses of worship cannot accommodate the amount of worshipers who are, doing said worship in these places. But what I will say is the prayer in Times Square is not something that I agree with. The reason being, one, it's this public spectacle. A lot of people are seeing it. A lot of people are heckling. A lot of people are angry, blowing their whistles, potentially throwing things at Muslims. This could harm the brothers. Secondly, masajid are of the plentiful in New York City. There's masjids everywhere. And so to say that we prayed in Times Square because there weren't room in other mosques, I think is a lie. I think that there's several mosques actually within close proximity of Times Square. Also, you're freezing. Why would you want to pray outside when you get a larger reward for praying inside of the mosque alongside your brothers? And this can mess up your khushu', which, if those of you, and I'm going to have to translate everything here because I'm sure we have a lot of non-Muslims watching, but khushu' is your focus in salah, or your focus in prayer. And that's one of the pillars of the prayer, and that's an important aspect of it. And something that can interrupt that is bright lights, is people walking by, is people heckling you, is people recording you, saying, why are you doing this? And so it's not that it's halal and haram, and that's not what I'm saying here whatsoever. What I'm saying is, I can certainly see how certain scholars would look at these situations of us praying in Times Square, us praying in public areas, and say it's certainly makruh, it's unliked. And the reason for that is because the ROI is low. It opens up Muslims to many attacks from non-Muslims. And I understand there's going to be some arguments of Muslims saying, well, we're celebrating our faith. Yeah, but Islam is not to be celebrated, it's to be practiced. We have 2 days a year that's designated for celebration. That's Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr. And in regards to celebration, if you want to celebrate your salah, there's a better place to do it. That's the mosque. That's the house of Allah, and that's where God ordained you to pray. Not only that, but glorifying the house of Allah is important, and so you get a far more reward for praying inside the mosque. I would never be interested in praying outside if a mosque was available to me, and the same thing should be said for any other Muslim. Now, I want to highlight some stipulations or some nuance and some intricacies here. Obviously, if you're in public and you don't have access to a mosque, or you need to get somewhere and you're from A to B, I can certainly understand why somebody would pray maybe on the corner by themselves or with a couple buddies in public. To me, again, that's fine. But to do a whole congregational mass prayer in Times Square, I mean, an area that is congested with foot traffic, an area that is congested with cameras, lights, tons of things that can distract you, I don't find that appropriate, personally. And I'll show my dalil or my evidence for that. But regardless of intention, it's just provocative. And I think that's the most important thing to understand and highlight. And we live in a time of great cultural tension. And so I think sometimes Muslims have a hard time or a difficulty in reading the room, or they want to be defiant. And I can understand we want to stand with our own side, and we want to take our own side. And I'm all for that. But there's ways to go about that. And I don't think that it's an effective method of da'wah to pray in public. Now, one may say, oh, well, we had some brothers or some sisters convert, or we had some people accept Islam by seeing it. Yeah, but that's also the wrong framework to operate from, because in the Quran, Allah says, Allah yahdi man yasha, Allah guides whom He wills. And so if somebody is going to be rightly guided to Islam, then it's going to happen regardless of you praying in public or not. Allah says in the Quran, Wallahu a'lamu bima muhtadeen. Allah knows who is fit for guidance. Allah knows who can be fit to accept Islam. Some people will see these public prayers and get angry and never accept Islam. And some people may never even see a Muslim in their life, but somehow stumble across a Quran and end up accepting Islam. The greater point is to be made here is that I don't think that this is an effective form of da'wah. You set up a table and you set up a sign and you say, ask me questions about Islam. I think that's totally fine. I think that's the way you should do da'wah, call to tawheed and things like that. But a public prayer, I think that it can hurt us more than help us. And the ROI for me just simply isn't there. It creates obstacles for Muslims more so than helps them in any regard. Again, it's not a matter of halal, haram, or anything like that, but the masjid is always the best place to pray. And so it's just necessary for Muslims to try and access a masjid when it's readily available to them. Now, in regards to praying in the street and everything like that, I do have some hadith here that I want to go over, and people just think that I may be speaking on my whims and desires, but this is actually something that's legitimate. And so we can pull this up on screen here, and let me know if your stream can see this, Myron.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. So this is Islam Q&A, and some people may not like the website, but the sources that I'm going to extract these fatwas from, or these rulings from, are highly revered and respected Islamic scholars. So it reads here that the Prophet, peace be upon him, designated 7 places that a Muslim should not pray. As we know, or maybe many of you don't know, the earth is valid to pray on. All of the earth is considered a masjid, right? So in times of necessity, you can pray somewhere that would be a little bit unorthodox if need be. Again, if you don't have access to a masjid, but 7 places are forbidden regardless. It says garbage dumps, slaughterhouses, graveyards, the middle of the road, bathrooms, camel pens, and the top of the Kaaba. But this hadith is inauthentic, and I want to make sure I read this here. But there's other hadith that are tied up in other chains because there's a gap in the chain. And if you guys don't know,
can you explain to them what a hadith is and the difference between that and the Quran, by the way?
So Quran is the direct word of Allah verbatim. Hadith is narrations or things or sayings of the Prophet that are passed down through a rigorously vetted form of chain of narration. And so if there's any gap in that chain, so essentially the Prophet told this guy told this guy, this guy told this guy, this guy told this guy. If there's any gap or there's any issue with one of the people who received the story or received the saying in that chain, he had bad memory, he wasn't trustworthy, he was publicly sinful, anything like that, immediately the hadith is either rendered super weak or invalid overall. And there's gradings to hadith and there's a whole science on it. And so it's a very difficult thing to understand and conceptualize really. But what is important to understand is hadith are rigorously vetted. And so these are narrations or sayings from the Prophet that are passed down via oral transmission. And what we can extrapolate here is that there is some authentication and something to be said about these hadiths in regards to 2 major prominent scholars, Sheikh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, many of you may know him if you're Muslim, and then al-Albani, who was a hadith specialist. And if we go down here, we can see the 4th reason, or the 4th place that's forbidden, is the middle of the road. And so they found some authentication in this hadith. You can read it here in detail, but I don't want to take too much time and get into the nuance of all of it. But let's go ahead and read this. It says, this refers to a road that is used by people as for a disused road or the side of the road, as I mentioned earlier, where people do not walk or travel, it's not forbidden to pray there. The reason for the prohibition on praying in the middle of the road is that it makes the way narrow and prevents the people from passing. And it is a distraction to the worshiper himself, as he will be so distracted he will be unable to pray properly. Praying in the middle of the road is not recommended, disliked, again like the ruling I had mentioned earlier, makruh, and may even be prohibited. If it harms people from preventing from passing, or the one who does that exposes himself to harm. Again, in the situation of Times Square, how many people were blowing whistles, how many people were heckling at the brothers who were praying? This could potentially open Muslims up to a physical harm or even harm on social media, where now we go viral and everybody's attacking us. And I understand, hey, we're unapologetic about our faith. Yeah, but we don't have to invoke this kind of attack if we just do what we're supposed to do and pray inside the mosque. So this can be avoided altogether. It's a net negative. It's a loss entirely. And an exception from that is made in the cases of need or necessity, such as Jum'ah prayer or Eid. So when the mosque is full and people had to leak out into the parking lot or the street, then in that instance, that would be totally fine because it's a necessity. There's nothing you can do there. Now, I have a video. This is a prominent, and I listen to this guy a lot. His name is Uthman al-Khamis. He is a Kuwaiti scholar. May Allah bless him. And I listen to a lot of his videos and his fatwa and everything like that. And his teacher, if I'm not mistaken, was Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, who is a very, very well-respected scholar in the Islamic world and legendary, probably one of the best scholars when it came to fiqh, hadith, Quran, everything. He was a specialist across the whole board and well-respected and revered in Saudi Arabia and the entire Middle East and the whole world for that matter. And so that was this guy's teacher, if I'm not mistaken. It was either Ibn Baz or Ibn Uthaymeen. I think Ibn Uthaymeen, because of the recency. But we'll go in here and we'll take a listen to what he has to say. Now, I apologize, I couldn't find a video in English, but this is in Arabic. I'll play it through really quickly and then I'll just translate it for you guys after. But the essence of what he's saying is there. So again, many people may not be able to understand that, but what he's essentially saying there is, and this reads, لا تجوز الصلاة في قرية طريق لأنه في إيذاء الناس, which means that it's not okay to pray in the street if it can cause a hardship or a difficulty for people. And I would like to think that Times Square applies to this instance because, as we know, Times Square is an area that is rampant with foot traffic. People are there taking photos. People are there sightseeing, walking around. And so it's not that we're making everybody's life impossible. And I'm not trying to be an apologist for people who are in Times Square and crying and everything like that. But I think that this situation applies to that because a mosque is well within accessibility for many of the worshipers, or if not all the worshipers here and all the brothers that are praying and the sisters, I think, behind them. And so for that, I just don't find it to be necessary. Remember, whether the United States is a Christian country or it's a Muslim country, it doesn't even matter what your opinion is. That's irrelevant to what I'm saying here. Praying in public when a mosque is accessible, especially when it warrants attack and it opens Muslims up to potential physical harm or harm online, is unnecessary. It also opens up the door to something called Ryad, which is the concept of showing off in Islam. And I'm not saying anybody here is, but it opens the door. And in Islam, you always want to take 2 steps before a sin can come in and try to eradicate it. So this is something that can also be introduced as something called showing off or Ryad, which would render the salah or your deed invalid and actually make you sinful. And I think instances like this can introduce that reality or Ryad entering your heart, whether you desire it or not. You know, you're praying, there's cameras, everybody's watching you, the Quran recitation is very nice. And so one thing can lead to another, and I don't think that this is helpful, nor does it really guide our brothers in the right direction. And for anybody who wants to make the argument for da'wah's sake, like I said, Allah guides whom He wills. And so we don't need to make a public spectacle like this and provoke people, because it only necessitates, or it really breeds more harm to the ummah and Muslim people altogether, more so than people think. But that's kind of my take on it. And I think I kind of went through everything, but the country is,
Good.
I think, 68% Christian, 1.3% Muslim. I think it's like 8% Jewish, something like that. Regardless, Muslims make up a staggering minority of the population in the United States, just over 3 million. And so to say that Muslims are, taking over and everything like that, I can understand how people are getting mad at that. But the real idea to understand here is, if you're a non-Muslim and you're seeing this, it bothers you because Islam is growing at a rapid rate. And what you're doing is something that's supposed to be done in the masjid anyways. So it's like this double issue that clash heads and just create for more problems. Rather, we can just pray inside of the mosque and avoid this altogether. And we can do our da'wah tables. People who like Sheikh Uthman ibn Farouk, who does this very well, may Allah bless him, he does da'wah tables, and I think that's cool. But to do things like this, I think is provocative and a little bit more damaging to our reputation than one may think. And again, it's majority Christian. We celebrate 2 major holidays in the United States, at least Christians do that, being Easter and Christmas. Everybody goes to church or mass on those days. Even if somebody is not a hard line, Catholic Christian or Orthodox Christian or even Protestant Christian, many people culturally identify with the religion. And so I would say that this is a majority Christian country. It's not a Christian theocracy, but people try to do this whole spin-off where they say, well, the country was founded by Protestants or Freemasons. And yeah, although there is some truth to that, that doesn't change the fact that Christians make up a majority of the country, and there is some sort of Christianity trickled into the historical aspect of not only finding the country, but the forefathers who built the country. There's a bunch of Christianity in there. There's very little Islam. There's very little Judaism. Even with Islam, I know people are going to say, well, Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. Again, I'm not saying these guys were hardline Christians that created a theocracy, but the cultural makeup and denomination of the United States is overwhelmingly Christian. And so this is another reason as to why this is kind of a bad idea and is a little bit more provocative than maybe some of the brothers intended. Go ahead. From a broad perspective globally, somebody will look at the United States and consider it a Christian country. That just has to do with the religious makeup. I believe it's about 68% Christian, and that's just the people who actually say, I'm a Christian. How many people live in the United States that don't claim a religion but still will say, I celebrate Christmas, I celebrate Easter, I guess I believe in Jesus? There's millions of people like that. Probably a majority of the people watching the stream would even say things like that. And so I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that the United States isn't this Christian country. That doesn't mean we can't have our mosques. That doesn't mean we can't do our da'wah. That doesn't mean we can't try and bring people to what I think is the truth, which is Islam. But that also means we have to move accordingly and calculate our decisions in so that we don't invoke attacks like this online from people who are already thirsty to attack Muslims and look at every single drop or every single reason to do so. Now, look, if you're hell-bent about Muslims praying in Times Square more so than the war in Iran, then you're an absolute retard. There's nothing to be said anything further. That's not even, a question. Of course, we understand there's legitimacy, or there's a hierarchy in terms of how important things are. Jeffrey Epstein and his files, the war in Iran, Benjamin Netanyahu being in Mar-a-Lago like 7 times since the beginning of Trump's presidency. These are all, I would say, larger issues. But just because two things exist at the same time doesn't mean that one cancels the other out. This is still an issue for people who aren't Muslim and they feel like their space is being troped on or invaded on. And it's important for us to make sure that we can create a healthy environment that feels like we all coexist well. And I think that will liken people to Islam or even turn their gears in a better way so that they may be questioning the religion or may be curious as to ask us about questions and you know, want to learn about the religion from a genuine perspective. But I think that this can sometimes shut people down in a negative way. And by the way, that clip of Asim al-Hakim, he's like a student of knowledge, but he's somebody who gives knowledge in fatwas, and he's very knowledgeable. And he says that the United States is a Christian country in regards to the meat. And in the Quran, God ordained the people of the book and the way that they slaughter meat, or their meat that they slaughter, halal for us. He says, وَطَعَامُ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ حِلٌّ لَكُمْ. The food of those who are from the people of the book has been made halal for you. And so that's why a lot of scholars like Sheikh Saleh Al-Fawzan, Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, Sheikh Ibn Baz, and many other big names always go and say the food in the United States for the most part should be okay because it's a large makeup majority of Christians, a few Jews, and then the rest are just anomalies or Muslims. And you know, the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself even ate the meat of the Jewish people who would gift him food, and he wouldn't ask them how they killed it. And so that's another reason as to why we can extrapolate that meat in the United States. And this goes into a whole different rabbit hole. I don't want to go too far here, but there's different opinions on what's halal and what's not halal. But this gives us some evidence as to why we call the United States a Christian country, especially in the Middle East when it comes to these fatwas. It's because of the whole idea of Christians and Jews and whether their meat is permissible. And it just so happens that every single time a scholar is asked about America, they say America is Dawlatun Nasara. You know, it's a Christian country. It's not a theocracy. And I understand Islamic countries are theocracies, right? Emirat, the 50 Muslim countries, many of them are theocracies. I get that. And so they're religiously governed and they're running with Sharia law. The United States is different. That does not cancel out the point that the majority of people in the United States are Christian, and culturally this country is Christian. And so doing things like this are hurtful for optics. That's my point.
Yeah.
So this is Ahlus Sunnah Fort Wayne Masjid. And by the way, I don't want anybody to think I'm some strict, like, hardline Salafi. And I'm not saying there's a negative connotation with that, but I'm not. I would just call myself somebody who's Muslim, and I try to stay as close and parallel and adhere to the Quran and Sunnah, and that's how I gather my opinions. But I'm not this like crazy extremist Salafi person or anything like that. So please don't believe that I have that framework just because I'm reading this mosque, which I assume is a Salafi's mosque, statement in regards to Times Square. But they read here, "Dear beloved Muslims," or it reads, "Dear beloved Muslims, when people who follow those who have never truly studied their religion with scholars or their students, the result is individuals who misguide rather than guide the masses. To the average observer, such actions may seem good, but they see people praying publicly and assume this is a form of dawah. But we must look deeper. Firstly, like I said earlier, it's obligatory for Muslim men to establish prayers in the mosque. Choosing instead to pray in the streets while neglecting the house of Allah is a serious matter. Again, like I said, it's highly unnecessary. It just doesn't make any sense." He also introduces khushu', right? Khushu', true humility and focus, being locked in